Well, welcome everybody to Rec Love Reflections. My name is Vanessa, and we are here learning more about Finnish pedagogy and how to transform our classroom into 21st century learning environments for our students. We've been talking in the last few weeks about visible thinking. I've shared a few micro training sessions and how to make learning more visible. So today, I wanted to connect those ideas, the visible thinking micro trainings, with how to lesson plan. So today's topic is how visible thinking shapes tomorrow's lesson plan. The purpose of this episode is to help you as teachers to understand that lesson planning, assessments, reflections, and visible thinking are one continuous learning cycle. They're not separate tasks. We are creating a system that gives us the information we need to properly design our lessons so that the days are engaging, the students are being creative and solving problems and using critical thinking. I'm going to connect this episode with several of the micro trainings I recently did so that there is a coherent way of working through all of these different concepts and showing you guys how it is aligned with Finnish-inspired pedagogy and it's adaptable to any classroom in the world. So one of the problems that I've heard and listened to teachers share with me is that lesson planning is done in isolation. Teachers are asked to do lesson plans at the beginning of the school year, before the first quarter, before the first month, oftentimes knowing nothing about the students that are coming, and they're expected to create lesson plans based from the pacing guides that come out of the textbooks and the curriculum that they're using. And so it's difficult to create proper lesson plans. There's very little assessment data that teachers have when they're lesson planning in this way. And so it doesn't really create meaningful learning. And teachers have told me that they feel like they're guessing what their students are going to need next. So planning is expected to be precise, but without enough information from the students and the input from the students. So let's reframe this lesson planning idea and change a little bit. So lesson planning doesn't begin with the lesson plan. It begins with insight into learning. And the way that we get that is through visible thinking with our students. Planning in this way will become lighter when it is responsive, when it is proactive rather than predictive or reactive. Right? So planning is not about control or perfection. It's about responsiveness. We want our lesson plans to respond to our students daily and have it geared or connected to what our students need at that moment. So we want to use visible thinking as the bridge between the learning and the planning. Learning alone doesn't make understanding visible. Right? We have to actually provide students with time and tools to share the process of what they are learning, because that's where we're going to find the gaps. That's where we're going to find the places where we need to dig deeper in our lesson planning to support our students. So visible thinking happens when students externalize their thinking. And we can do this in a variety of ways in the classroom. And I've shared quite a few tools over the last couple of weeks, but we can do it through talking, through writing, through sketching, through movement, through reflection. Silence and pause are also part of this thinking process. In our Think, Pair, Share that I recently did in the micro training, we talked about the importance of giving students time to think. So visible thinking is not a performance. We're not looking at the visible thinking as a place where we can grade the students, where there's a right and a wrong. It's more of an opportunity for students to share where they are at in the learning process. So visible thinking is about how teachers gain access to learning. And some of the tools that we use, I've already been talking about. These, we are going to kind of call them listening tools because micro-assessments are embedded in daily learning. And when we use these micro-assessments throughout the day, we gain artifacts that we can share with parents and administration, and we gain the information that we need to plan for tomorrow. So they're low pressure They're formative, and their purpose is basically for listening, not grading. We're not expecting the students to get everything right when we use these micro assessments. Some of the examples that I have already shared with you: think, pair, share, done right. That one I did this past week. Daily reflection questions. That one was a couple weeks ago. Exit reflections we've talked about also in the past. Confidence check-ins. Those are new. I will be doing micro training on that. And then student artifacts and evidence walls. And I've talked about evidence walls and student artifacts that come from learning stations. So you can find videos on all of those. And these are not add-ons. I'm not talking about adding, like this is something new that you need to put into your lesson plan. This is just a part of the activity. This is how we begin, or we end, or we stop in the middle and take a moment to process. So it's information gathering. Like I said, it's not for grading. We're not looking for the right answers. We as teachers are using this opportunity to investigate how well the lesson is going for the students. And what are teachers actually listening for? So we're listening for patterns of confusion, right? Rather than individual correctness, we're looking across the classroom for repetitive confusion, or in fact, repetitive confidence, right? So maybe the class is getting all of step 1, but they sort of get bogged down in step 2 in one of your math exams or whatever. So we want to find out where those gaps are, whether the questions are being asked, the same questions are being asked again and again and again, or there's similar confusions across the classroom, maybe shared misconceptions. We want to look for language usage and reasoning, right? Critical thinking skills. How are they connecting the dots? Do they connect them with confidence? Are they unsure, but they're correct? Are they unsure and they're not correct? Right? How ready are they to move on? So assessment becomes sense-making rather than an evaluation. So this learning cycle, this is a learning cycle for teachers, which is fun because we're always talking about learning cycles for students. But in this podcast, we wanted to talk about learning cycles for teachers. So this cycle will explain how daily classroom moments naturally shape planning. So we start with learning. We do a bit of a reflection. Then we ask the students to make their thinking visible. And as teachers, we will listen during this time. This isn't a lecture time or really getting into telling the students things. It's more listening and questioning. And then we take that information, those patterns, those repetitive confusions or the confidence that they might have, and we design tomorrow's lesson. And then we repeat the process. And then tomorrow we start again with learning. And we go through our days and our topics and our subjects in this way. So in the learning step, students engage in the task, the discussion, or the inquiry. And learning is happening, but often remains internal, right? They're just doing it on their own and they're thinking about it silently and they're working on it by themselves. The reflection part is where students are going to pause to consider what they understood or questioned. It can be a self-reflection, or it can be peer reflection, or it can be large group reflection. And it may be written, it may be verbal, it may be visual, or it can be silently, but it's where meaning making begins. Then we move into the visible thinking step. So this is where reflection becomes observable, right? This is where teachers can really hone in and find out where the students are in the lesson. So thinking is externalized through the talking, the writing, the artifacts, the symbols, the walls that we put the sticky notes on, things like that. This is where understanding becomes visible. Not only for the students, this is also visible thinking is where the students are really going to connect the dots and all the light bulbs are going to start clicking on, but it's also very much so where the teacher is going to really begin to see the gaps when this thinking becomes visible. And then listening. So teachers observe and listen for patterns. Attention shifts from answers to understanding. So we're not listening, like I said, for the right answer. We're listening for the process. How did they get to this point? And listening is the teacher's core professional act. This is so important for teachers to pause and take time to listen. Because once they've done that, then planning successfully and engagingly will happen. So planning responds to what the students show. The decisions include if we're going to move forward, if we're going to stay here, the pacing of the lesson, how we're going to group the students in small group activities, where the focus will be, whether we want to add a quick warm-up tomorrow just for a review or reinforcement of the information, or whether we need to take a few moments to reteach or readjust our learning stations and really focus on certain areas of the lesson so that the students can have additional practice in those areas in their station learning. So the key idea here is lesson planning becomes a response, not a guess, right? So now when you've listened and you have the patterns and you understand where the gaps are, now tomorrow your lesson plan will be so much more effective because you will be able to redesign the lesson and it becomes the next learning experience. The cycle repeats naturally. Tomorrow you start again with the new plan that you have in place, and planning becomes embedded in teaching, not separate from it. How does this align with Finnish pedagogy? Well, learning is meaning making, right? We're not learning for the sake of a test or to answer a question. We're learning because we want to affect our world and we need to understand our world and we need to connect what we're learning to our world. Assessment is formative and reflective. Teachers are the observers and the professional design makers. I've talked about this in the past as if the teacher is the engineer and you come to the class with this blueprint, but then it's just the skeleton blueprint. And the students are the ones that add the doors and the walls and the windows and the furniture and all of what goes into a blueprint for a house. The students are a part of that process. There's trust in students' voice, and we create student autonomy and agency in this way when we expect them to share their learning process. And then, of course, there's more flexibility over rigid scripting. So traditionally, lesson plans were rigid and we went step by step through the lesson plan. And so long as we did that, our administration was happy and we just moved on. But in 21st century learning, we really need to focus on where the students are and how we can be flexible. And this is a Finnish-inspired practice adapted for global classrooms. It's not a fixed script or a universal rule that you have to follow. Why this cycle creates calm classrooms. Basically, we end up with teachers who feel confident in what they are doing, how they are presenting the lessons. Planning is clearer and lighter. It's less time consuming because initially we're just creating the outline and then the students are filling in the gaps. So the responsibility and the ownership comes from both the student and the teacher. Students begin to feel seen and heard. When they're given autonomy and agency in the classroom, they'll be more motivated, behavior issues will decrease, and classrooms will become more responsive. So calm emerges from clarity, not control. We've talked a little bit about this idea of control, how in the past, classrooms that were considered under control were the ones that had the students sitting in the desk quietly being passive learners. And that's not how a 21st century classroom is going to really effectively support the learners. We want students to be active learners. We want them to be participants in the process. We want them to be guiding and directing the learning that they are interested in. So just quickly in closing, visible thinking during the day removes isolation from planning. The teacher's burden is lightened because the students are part of this process. And teachers begin to plan with evidence, right? So the administration, the parents will begin to see progress because the teachers are picking up the small moments where the students are not understanding and recycling back into those. So what happens is we have assessment, reflection, and planning, and they all become one process, right? So our final anchor idea for today is when student thinking is visible, lesson planning becomes clear. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our episode today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Recla Reflections, and I hope to see you next time.